I'm Elizabeth Castelli. I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I'm the moderator of this panel. I wanted to let you know that the program announces that Laura McTighe from Dartmouth College is on this panel, but she fell ill and was unable to come. And so rather than trying at the last minute to have a substitute, we thought we would just actually have a panel that's not completely rushed and have two very fulsome presentations from two wonderful colleagues. So I'm very excited to have them here with us. I'm sorry Laura can't be with us, but we will honor her by doing a great panel. And so we have two panelists on this panel, which is devoted to community and activist archives. So it's a little bit different from what we were doing this morning. This is focused on projects that are trying to preserve histories of both communities and also intentionally formed communities, that is activist groups. And the issues that emerge out of the formation of such archives, what we should be thinking about when we create these collections of materials that document pasts that maybe don't always get into the mainstream history books and are telling stories that are a very recent history, as we'll see. So we're going to go all the way back to the 1970s and work our way forward. I, who am a historian of antiquity, I think we're talking about the last 5 minutes. But anyway, so I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions for our two speakers. They have bios in the program, but they are Maria Cotera here from the University of Michigan. She is Associate Professor of Women's Studies and American Culture and is also the director of the Latino Studies program there. And she's going to be talking to us about the archive project that she has developed, Chicana por mi raza. And then Shawn Smith-Cruz, who is at the CUNY Grad Center Library and also here representing the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And she has a couple of different projects she's going to talk to us about. Each of them is going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a little conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to questions. All right?
So today I am going to share with you a project that I've been working on in collaboration with a filmmaker and now doctoral student, Linda Garcia Merchant, and many, many students, one of whom is here in this room, and other scholars. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about what it means to elaborate a Chicana digital praxis vis-a-vis archiving in our archiving project. So like many archiving projects that are independently initiated, like mine was, not coming out of a library, it's really responding, Chicana por mi raza, the project I'm going to talk about today, is really responding to some pretty significant historical absences. And they, I think, are emblematized by these two iconic images of the Chicano movement in the Southwest. This is an image of men in front of the Escuela Tlatelolco in Denver, where the Denver Youth Conference was held in 1969, and also the Miss America Up Against the Wall action in Atlantic City in 1968, correct? I've got to make sure I have my feminist history down. I mean, I think these two images are very emblematic of the historiography in general. They're a good little heuristic to understand like where the absences that my project responds to are coming from. This is a picture of a brown beret woman who worked in a kitchen where welfare moms worked in LA. This was one of the brown beret projects that doesn't get written about as much, along with the Free Clinic and other women-led projects inside of that nationalist group. I have personal reasons for being interested in this history. My mother was a Chicana feminist in the 1970s and 60s. She was a radical librarian and worked building collections, libraries, and resource centers. Some of you from the 70s will remember the many, many ethnic studies and women's studies clearinghouses that were developed. One of those projects was the Chicana Research and Learning Center, which she established in 1974 with the Women's Educational Equity Act grant with Evie Chapa, who was at that time a doctoral student. It's important to note that this project, the Chicana Research and Learning Center, which was housed in Texas, Austin, Texas, was a project that was outside of the aegis of an institution, right? So it's arising, this sort of independent publishing house and clearinghouse for materials on women of color and Chicanas is really arising outside of the developing fields of women's studies or departments or disciplines of women's studies and Chicano studies in Texas at the time. It's an independent project. My mother was also a writer and wrote 2 foundational texts, The Chicana Feminist and Diosa y Hembra. Diosa y Hembra was the first history of Chicanas. It was published in 1976, but again, it has a prehistory. It's developed from her feminist writings from the early 1970s up until 1976 on history in particular, and she was given another HEW grant from the federal government to write a profile on the Mexican-American woman. She received copyright for that material. It's an important history, right? The federal government funded the study. She received copyright and then published it as this feminist book in 1976. And The Chicana Feminist, which is a collection of her feminist writing from the 70s. Both of these books, of course, are self-published and out of print. So to what do we owe these historical absences? Well, this is the sort of classic picture of the archive that most of us who are historians who have been in an archive, you know, this is what they look like. Sometimes we don't even get to be in these stacks, right? They roll things out in carts and we can look at them in the reading rooms, right? But this is the status, right, of institutional knowledge and power, right? This is the home of knowledge power. Here's what the Chicana archive looks like. And this is just snapshots taken from my mother's office. But what I would like to say is that this archive looks very much like the, you know, dozens of archives that we have visited for this project. They're usually in attics, basements, garages. They're under beds and mixed in on the bookshelves of these women's homes. They're in closets, right, and home offices. And this is what we are contending with in this project, a massive amount of resources scattered across the country. I like to think of it as an archival archipelago, right, of Chicana feminism that has not been collected in institutional archives. And one of the reasons why the archive, you see that sort of drastic difference between the institutional archive and the Chicana archive that we have encountered across the country is what I call the feedback loop. And this will be very familiar to those of you who are historians. And what is the feedback loop? Well, you know, if materials on women are not in archives, or are difficult to find in archives, or are uncatalogued in archives, in other words, they're disappeared from institutional archives, and if historians create their evidentiary base largely from institutional archives, then what you're going to see is histories of the women's movement and histories of the Chicano movement that don't include women, right? Because they're not in that sort of evidentiary base. They're not, you know, when people go looking for evidence, all they see is evidence of absence, right? But as an archivist, if you try to make an argument to your institution for collecting Marta Cotera or, you know, Dorinda Moreno or whoever, their archive, and there's no historiography that includes that woman, you're going to have a hard time getting your institution to dedicate space, which is very valuable in libraries, in order to collect that archive. So there's a feedback, a negative feedback loop going on. If the women aren't in the historiography, then they're not going to be in archives. And if they're not in archives, they're not going to be in the historiography. So Linda and I, thinking about this, and I should also mention that Linda, my collaborator in this project, is a documentary filmmaker. And when we first came up with this idea, I had just finished my first monograph, and she had just finished her first documentary film on Chicanas who had been very active in the National Women's Political Caucus, and including her mother and my mother. So we came together around this issue of absence, and she could not imagine spending the next 10 years making another film, right, the glacial pace of filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, to intervene, right, in that feedback loop. And I couldn't imagine, you know, collecting, doing all this archival work to write a monograph, one book that maybe gets 500 printings and reaches 500 people or goes to libraries, right? So what we decided was to interrupt the loop by creating our own archive and by encouraging other scholars to use our archive as we're creating it. The normal sort of mode of production for historians and anyone who's writing about the past from a sort of academic perspective is to collect archives and to hoard them and not let anyone else see them. So we were going to do this the opposite way, right? We were going to collect archives, make them immediately available, encourage scholarship, and then when we were ready to make our interventions, to insert those interventions into what we hoped would be a broad expanse of scholarship. We wanted to collectivize the archive. But we also didn't want to create or replicate the institutional power structures, the knowledge power system that governs most archives. So we said, what are our guiding questions? And we asked ourselves, is it possible to interrupt the erasures that happen in the archive knowledge system? How do we recuperate the past without enacting new erasures? Can we create an archive that responds to the radical potential of the memory practices it documents? In other words, we don't want to create another institutional archive that sort of doesn't honor the ways of work of these women, which is very collective and collaborative. Can an archive become a site of encounter or encuentro rather than a repository for dead letters about the past? And can it become a place where new ways of producing and exchanging knowledge are explored? Our idea was to create a Chicana digital memory collective that was open to scholars, students, and teachers. My primary aims for the project are to collect and preserve oral histories and documents, documenting Chicana activism and praxis, feminist praxis, to collaborate with other scholars, students, and community members to build the project, and there's a very important pedagogical aspect to the project. So I want to sort of turn to the project now and make an argument for what this Chicana digital praxis looks like. And I'm using a Venn diagram here, and you'll notice that there's, all of the sort of aspects of the project really overlap. And in those overlapping spaces, this is where I identify a Chicana digital praxis. So first and foremost, the most important thing that we are doing right now is, in the realm of knowledge production, is creating the archive itself. We have, through our partner projects and through our own oral history interviews, have collected about 150 oral histories, ranging in length from 2 to 4 hours, sometimes 8 hours if we have multiple days. We have interviewed Chicanas who are quite well known nationally on the national scale, but we've also interviewed those grassroots workers who were not known at all. So we are really, and our approach to interviewing is to begin with a woman and then to sort of ask her about her circle, right? So otherwise known as snowball sampling. These are not great, these are pretty hard to see what our repository looks like. I'm actually happy, in the Q&A, if we have time, to go into our repository and show you how it's organized. We have about 10,000 archival documents in this collection. About maybe less than a third, maybe a quarter, are still being processed, so they're on various hard drives, have not been uploaded and cataloged quite yet, but are in some part of the process. Our digital repository was actually developed for the natural sciences, environmental sciences, and we kind of bootstrapped it because it happened to work great for organizing multimedia archives. And these are just, this is an image of our full, what our collection page looks like, and that's a single document. It's a very easy to use system and very easy to train students. One of the really interesting things that has arisen in terms of when we think about digital knowledge production is the applications that many of these documents that we've collected can be put to. So my partner in this project, Linda Garcia Merchant, has created an incredible scalar project that documents the sort of, and also includes personal reflections, but it's really documenting the work of the National Women's the Chicana caucus in the National Women's Political Caucus, and where all of these women were sort of situated, where they did their politics and how they elaborated in a network their feminist praxis. Another aspect of overlap between knowledge production and pedagogy, and in fact our mission to be a public humanities project. So I would define the Chicana por mi Raza project as a digital public humanities project, right? So it's outward facing, even though the repository is actually login protected for all sorts of reasons that I can get into in the Q&A, we have a public presence, and that public presence is through our website. I can also take you to our website in the Q&A. The important feature, right, one important feature of our website is that students curate the various kinds of curations that we include in our public website. So for example, we have a page called the Mujeres page, and these are bios written by the students who have processed the oral histories and archives, and these bios include images drawn from the archives that the students curate. They choose the images that they are most interested in, and biographies, short biographies of the women, and in some cases, clips of their oral history. We have also just started a feature for students who want to drill down deeper and broader into the archive. This is our Historia section. And in this section, students write historical essays based on particular research questions that they're interested in. So for example, there's one, the death of Jose Torres. This was a research question that a student had after looking at some photos and trying to identify of a march, of a rally, and trying to identify where they came from. These were photos taken by Nancy de los Santos. We scanned like 2,500 of her photos from the 1970s. The student saw one sign that said, "Justice for Jose Torres," and then went down a rabbit hole on the internet and found all this material about this police murder in Houston in 1976, and then created, from this one photograph, did this massive research project and created this beautiful historia about the march that was photographed, but also about the riots that occurred in Houston as a result of this police murder. So, this brings us to the part of the Venn diagram that is pedagogy. And so we have like 3 parts to this diagram, right? Knowledge production, pedagogy, and community engagement. And they are, as I said, they're sort of interlocked. So when I think about the pedagogy of the project, I think first about the ways in which almost every single oral history trip we've taken, certainly all the scanning we've done on those trips, all the cataloging, all the processing, that has all been the labor of students, primarily undergraduate students. So they assist us at every level. I want to take you and just show some images from our various trips. From this sort of work, which I think is interesting, has interesting transgenerational dimensions, I've begun thinking about the archive not as a site or repository for the evidence of the past, but a site of encounter between the present and the past, through a feminist praxis, Chicana feminist praxis that I call encuentro. So we might think of encuentro as a Chicana feminist understanding of the work of historiography, of engaging with the past at a deep interpersonal level. And when I think about this archive as encuentro, I think about the archive not as the final product, the 10,000 documents, the hundreds of hours of oral history, but as the images you're looking at now, right? So the archive is live. We're not thinking about the archive as a place where we seek evidence of the past, but a place of liveness, where we encounter the past through subjects, memories, and through transgenerational experiences. The power of encuentro is so much more powerful than simply reading a history book about Chicanas in the 70s. And this comes back to my point of, I could have collected all this material and written, some kind of narrative about Chicana feminism. But what I would have missed, right, is that when students encounter the past in these highly interpersonal situations, where they're listening to women's stories and also going through their archives that are illustrating their stories, almost like a live illuminated text, it can be incredibly powerful. And one of the stories I always tell was the very first archive trip we took. We went to Texas to visit my mother, stay in her house, and interview her network of women who were involved in radical politics in Texas. And the students were absolutely captivated because they were living inside the archive. So we did visit archival, institutional archives like the Benson Latin American Collection to get some, sort of background information. But we spent most of the time going through and scanning parts of my mother's archives. And the students were allowed to scan the parts that interested them the most. And what ended up happening was very surprising is they wouldn't stop working. So I was back home in Austin, enjoying Austin and its nightlife and saying, like, it's 5, let's go. And I would go and come back and stumble back into the house, and they were still scanning archives. And I was like, you guys, this is child labor. I can't do this. You have to stop. And finally, on the last night, I was just like, you absolutely, I will not let you work past 5 tonight. You're going to go have fun. And so I sent them out, and they agreed, and they went out. They came back at 2 a.m. with these. So, and mind you, both of them had not been out of state before, and they're Michigan girls, never out of state. Their mothers dropped them off at my house and said, don't let any harm befall my beautiful daughter. And I said, don't worry, they'll be staying with my mom, we're good. So I just want to point out that these are images that have been taken from, they made photocopies of archival objects that fascinated them, took them to a tattoo artist, and had that person recreate those archival images on their flesh. So, you know, I'm thinking about this inscription of the past. I just want to also point out that this one on the right is actually retrofitting a classic image from the 1970s of the radical third world woman. Usually she's holding a baby, right, with a rifle across her back, and usually it's an Indo-Chinese woman. You know, it's a classic of the image repertoire of the 70s. But Carolyn, who's a radical farmer and a radical agrarian, replaced the baby with a sheaf of wheat. So I want us to think about this sort of engagement with the past as not just an adulation or utopian longing for some past time, but a merging of the past with the present with a kind of futurity. So learning from these processes of working with students, I also developed a course. And my idea for the course was that it could be used to, for other under-resourced institutions. They could take, we have a whole course guidelines with a syllabus, reading list, PDFs, guide to archiving, guide to cataloging, how to film, everything that someone would need to launch an oral history course to feed the project. So our repository can be uploaded, you can upload from anywhere. And so the idea was to go to community colleges, to work with universities like Rice University, with faculty who really wanted to teach but don't have the wherewithal of time to build a course like this. And so I taught and tested out the course over 2 semesters, and then passed along the material to 4 other institutions where archives have been collected and oral histories have been collected to our specifications and uploaded into our collection. The idea is to kind of crowdsource with certain limitations the archival ingestion, so growing our archive without me having to travel everywhere. Another important aspect of this project is public engagement, as I said before. And this also connects to pedagogy, because as a result of the classes that we did, we partnered with other classes in the School of Art and Design to create public exhibitions. So students, there's a class called Designing for Exhibition. We have thousands of archives. In some cases, our students collected them, right, from another class the previous semester, and we mounted 2 shows. One called Las Rebeldes, which was about women activists in southeastern Michigan in 2014, and then another show also curated by a class in the School of Art and Design called Chicana Fotos, which was a show derived from Nancy de los Santos's photographic collection, which documents social justice, particularly UFW activism in Chicago. We partnered with Wayne State, the Reuther Library, which has the largest collection of UFW materials, and my students were able to connect the photos to archival objects from their collection and to illustrate their archival objects in this exhibition. So when we talk about collaboration, we also have to think about how the way of work of this project and how it's so radically different from our individualized modes of production in the knowledge industrial complex. And so to do a project like this, you have to forge relationships between libraries, scholars, research institutes, community organizations, and cyber infrastructure specialists. That's the only way it can work. And so in terms of our cyber infrastructure, we've partnered with the National Center for Supercomputing. We've partnered with UIUC, the Institute for Computing and Humanities, Arts and Sciences, with the SEED project that developed our platform, and we currently have server space on advanced research computing at the University of Michigan. We've partnered pedagogically, so iterations of my class have been taught at UIC, University of Wisconsin, and Rice University, and we are launching a regional digital oral history project using our model for digital and oral history collection in New Mexico to document Enriqueta Vázquez, who was a major organizer in northern New Mexico, and whose house we would like to declare a historical monument. She's in her late 80s. And finally, I will say, you know, the scholarly productions have come, right? But they haven't been the most important thing about the project. And I just want to point to Chicana Movidas, a massive anthology, the first ever on Chicana movement practices and feminist practice in the Chicano movement. We have multi-generational scholars, and scholars that I've interviewed, women that I've interviewed have written critical essays. So Marta Cotera, Ana Nieto Gomez. So women of that generation have also written critical essays, not testimonios, not biographies, but essays about certain organizations. It's been really a powerful process putting together that book. But also the book Somos Latinas, it's from our partner project in Wisconsin. They did our oral history an oral history project where they contributed oral histories to Chicana por mi raza, but launched their own project. It's sort of a satellite project. And we get to, you know, they used all our tools, so we get to hold their digital images. The Wisconsin Historical Society gets to hold their actual archives, and they produced this amazing book of testimonios on Chicanas in Wisconsin, and Latinas in Wisconsin. So there are scholarly products. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, I've written before about what Chicana feminist archivista praxis looks like before and after the digital turn, because my mother herself was a radical librarian and archivist and collector of all kinds of things. But I think I want to push back against this idea, right, that there's a before and after the digital turn. And I think I'm going to say this, I think it's true for other women of color and feminist activists, right? In many ways, Chicanas have always used new technologies to preserve the past and to create collective visions of the future. In fact, my first research project when I was 14 years old was working on the biobibliographic Hispanic database of Hispanic women, a project of the Chicana Research and Learning Center run by my mother. This project was using the newest database technology. That is not a picture of me, but it is a picture of the machine I used and the floppy disks we used to create a database, an electronic database and resource that could be farmed out and shared before the internet. So my mother was already imagining, well, this could be on the ERIC clearinghouse. Those of you who are librarians and of a certain age will know what that is. You know, she had an idea that to create this. Of course, the project was defunded midstream by the Reagan administration, right? So it died. And the only evidence we have of it is this dot matrix printout, right, which is a photocopy that we made. And you can see the sort of old technology. This is actually the first page of a Chicana magazine. And so this printout was like in a folder and describing what was in the database, right? It was a folder, and it's a good thing too. She has all of these printouts because the database, of course, went away. The technology for the database went away, right? And those floppy disks are no longer accessible. So what I want to say, I guess, I mean, one could say, right, that this example of the dead database is maybe a prescriptive or a moral or a fable for us who are building this massive digital archive, and a reminder of the precarity, even in these technological times, of our projects, which will always be marginal, right, in terms of funding. And we have never received major funding from any major institution. Nevertheless, right, if we think of the archive as encuentro, as an act of autonomy and self-determination in the field of knowledge production, right, what is important, right, is not so much what we end up with and what can be saved, but that moment of encuentro, right, that moment of self-determination when we decide who we are and what we are. Thank you.
The Activist Women's Voices Oral History Project and Archive is held at the Graduate Center Library. Its project was committed to, hold on, wait for it. There we go. Its project was committed to documenting the voices of unheralded activist women in community-based organizations in New York City. The project was established in 1995 under the leadership of the directors of the Women's Studies Program and the Center for the study of women in society. Graduate students from different disciplines helped to lay the groundwork for the partnerships and were trained to conduct oral histories according to professional standards. I'm reading exactly what is on this brochure, which was created in 1995. Integrating this experience into their doctoral research, they, quote, transformed what is considered, quote, knowledge into the university. 32 women were interviewed from community groups such as the Family Violence Center, Coast to Coast Women of Color, the Weeksville Society for the Preservation of African American Culture and Heritage, Women Make Movies, the Lesbian History Archives, etc. The last interview was taped on May 14th, 1998. The information gathering process for this project was under the guise of an academic pedagogical agenda and archived mostly by the librarians on site. The interviews are now located in Art Store's institutional collections platform containing 292 items of audio, transcripts, ephemera, and clippings. I could go into further detail of this collection and even stream audio, but instead, if you're curious about the Activist Women's Voices collection, find me after the panel and you will come to the Graduate Center, log into a terminal, and sit and listen to the audio. I'm showing the Activist Women's Voices collection because it holds great significance, but also to juxtapose its institutionalization against collections that are not affiliated with academic institutions. While listening to the remainder of my talk, please consider that there are multiple ways to compile archives, and in the culling, the acquisition, processing, and dissemination, they all require labor that looks very different when it is community-based. And by community-based, I mean volunteer-led with no money, no salaries, on Saturdays at 2 p.m. The best way to provide case studies for archiving for activist movements was to detail the ways in which not only whether the content of the archive was considered activist, but also in the archiving itself as potentially a form of activism. Just like it did in 1995, almost 25 years ago, when the directors of the Center for Women in the Center for the Study of Women in Society at the Graduate Center took a bold move to interview activist women. What does the equivalent look like today? How are we responding to Hartman's quote for this panel, that every generation confronts the task of choosing its past? A recent study posed by psychologists at the Graduate Center, Susan Apatow and Kimberly Belmonte, interviewed 5 archivists, including myself, which is why I decided to choose this one, and Polly Thilsawaite. We are both from the Lesbian History Archives. And they sought to determine the relationship between archives and social justice. In this study, their methods point to 3 psychological models of justice: procedural, distributive, and inclusionary. Procedural justice in archives focuses on the fairness of procedures, specifically in the way that materials are acquired and as they respond to social change. A distributively just archive makes material about the distant or recent past, particularly information that is otherwise unknowable, available to the public, allowing interested people to connect with historical events and social issues. And finally, inclusionary justice challenges the very order of things, which critical scholarship calls on archivists to be social justice activists. Yesterday's open panel moderator asked the authors to name the relationship of the characters as they related to the going and coming of the mother. And I also love that Maria sort of started with her mother. There's my baby. As we speak of generations, I think we can look to the archives that exist already to consider the implications for the future that we are creating. So I can't be a librarian up here and not talk about how you can access archives yourself. So I'm just going to make sure that you do a little bibliographic instruction really quickly and make sure that you know that Archive Grid does exist. It's an OCLC project, and its aim is to be inclusive of all archives cataloged around the world, meaning all archives cataloged. So the Lesbian History Archives is not even in here, though they do include 5 million records describing archival materials. So that was just an aside. We're going to go back to the baby picture. Archives themselves act as social change agents, whether it be through their use or through their creation. So first I'm going to just talk about use. Using extensive archival research from American newspapers housed at the Library of Congress and Chicago Public Library. If you haven't already read this, put it on your summer reading list. Jam on the Vine by LaShonda Catrice Barnett is and there's her pretty face, is the coming of age story of a journalist named Evo. Her mother is named Lemon, and her mother has a self-sustaining ownership of a family-run jam business. Evo finds discarded newspapers of her mother's initial white employer. She reads them with fervor and then wins a writing competition, which leads to a scholarship to a local university where she falls in love with her college professor, Ona. Yes, it's lesbian love. And they launched Jam on the Vine, the very first Black woman-owned newspaper. Barnett uses a narrative as a tool for documentation and rewrites Black visibility in the early 20th century Kansas City. Barnett's characters represent a potentially undocumented or untimely forgotten community. Documentation is also present in the replication of archival records in the second portion of her novel, so it's literally split down the middle, and the second half is all archival use, filled with reproductions of letters and published news articles. These are very densely curated writings, and they're juxtaposed with a first kiss and passionate touches, and there is also a dildo. So when I wrote the book review for Jam on the Vine, Barnett sent me a tweet saying, "One of my students didn't read the book, but they read your book review. Thank you for the book review." When not creating our own narratives via fiction, we use pre-existing archives to stand in as forms of representation. So archives are also used for the construction of new information or dissemination of old. When the Schlesinger Library of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University announced the opening of the June Jordan Archives in 2012, it didn't take long for researchers to plow through the archival collection. Marilyn Morgan, manuscript cataloger, stated that the large collection contains a wealth of rare documents, including personal and professional correspondence, drafts of poetry, novels, essays, and plays, audio recordings of readings, hundreds of photographs, etc. With these materials, the June Jordan Estate, editors of We're On, a June Jordan Reader, Christoph Keller and Jan Heller-Levy, were archival curators framing Jordan's life into compartments like acid-free boxes. Each section, a collection contextualized with a finding aid-like description. The editors described the collection as, quote, a healthy sampling of June Jordan's fighting and loving words. But when describing their editorial choices, they exclaimed that it was centered, not finished, able to make changes. That is how they approached choosing and placing text from the very vast body of Jordan's writings. Their efforts were a clear and masterful culling. It took a series of labor to garner the permissions to bridge themes from within Jordan's very own canon, weaving together select excerpts to finally allow for a digestive monograph. When I wrote the book review for this book, for Mom Egg Review, the editors wrote me back, namely Jan, and she said, Since I was a daughter, sister, sorry, it's written right in front of me. Since I was a daughter, sister, student, sister of June's, I am so touched, as is Christoph, who joins me in this thanks for your praise that we have helped mother her for a new generation. The concept of mothering is one that I like to continue to explore as something of an aside as we consider intergenerational work. Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines has a section titled Mother Ourselves, a Black queer feminist genealogy for radical mothering, where Alexis Pauline Gumbs writes, the radical potential of the word mother comes after the M. It is the space that other takes in our mouths when we say it. We are something else. These very distinct points, I think, belong in the conversation of intergenerational experience and teaching as partnership in practice, especially as they relate to archives. Because alongside Gumbs's mothering, our Mother Lord teaches us that the, quote, generation gap is a tool to expel our oppression. And in that honoring, I'd like to showcase what it is that we do at the Lesbian Herster Archives, which is an intentional intergenerational space. Who in here does not know about the Lesbian Herster Archives? Don't be, okay. So I wanted to know if I should say more than, because once you've heard it and heard it and heard it. So the Lesbian Herster Archives is the largest lesbian archive in the world, it's the oldest lesbian archive in the world, and it's located in Brooklyn, in a limestone building. It's completely volunteer run. It's been around since 1974, and since the beginning it has been a home to lesbian materials and a home to a lesbian, so there is a caretaker on the premises. And the current caretaker is a Black lesbian, just wanted to shout that out. I'll throw in more facts about LHA as I go through. But here's an internal shot of the main floor in Brooklyn. And what's interesting is often researchers or volunteers or tourists come to LHA seeking a reflection of themselves. My experience has always been to respond to a Black lesbian researcher first with reassurance that although it's true that lesbian feminist history as we know it has a focus on the experience of white lesbians, there were indeed lesbians of color who actively engaged with the archive and therefore have donated their materials. We don't say no to any collection, so if anyone wants to donate their collection and they identify as lesbian, then they are welcome to. So even if little mention of their work exists beyond select notable anthologies, their stories have been captured and preserved as they intended here in the collection. And so my experience at the Lesbian Herster Archives has always been a very woman of color experience. So I just took some pictures from my Facebook. One was a Samia Bashir, hello dinner. And then the other is J.P. Howard, who is a poet. Her reading series with Cheryl Clark and other amazing poets around the table. Oh, more pictures. In 2010, I conducted an at-home for the Lesbian Herster Archives as a portion of the spring series for the In America They Call Us Dykes, Lesbian Lives in the 70s conference, sponsored by CLAGS. Still it was the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at the Graduate Center. At that event, I showcased the Black Lesbian in the 70s zine, an at-home tour to the Lesbian Herster Archives. The zine is a chronological, let's see if I can click this and it works. The zine is a chronological overview of the decade of 1970 to 1980, wherein each year we highlight portions of the collection of the Lesbian Herster Archives that pertain to Black lesbians. It is accompanied by a CD, which can come as an email of SoundCloud links. And during the presentation, Black lesbians were commissioned to act as players to perform the voices of the lesbians of the day. The event was so packed that not only did I get to play with Cheryl Dunye's suspenders, but I was also able to meet the women from whom we featured in the zine, including Georgia Brooks, who co-curated the first Black lesbian archival exhibit at the Lesbian Herster Archives, alongside Morgan Gwenwall and Paula Grant. I didn't take pictures of the day, but there were over 100 Black lesbians and allies and walkers sitting on floors, coexisting and absorbing the collection. No. Since then, Shirley Olafern, my very dear friend who helped me assemble the original zine on her living room floor after making photocopies at her job, went on to create the Black Lesbians in the 80s, 90s, and 2000 zine, I didn't have a picture of the 2000s, which followed a similar outline of clippings from the collection of LHA and distributed at zine fairs across the country and internationally. To bring it back home, Shirley started the Black Lesbian DIY Fest, first held at the Lesbian Herster Archives and then off-site, inviting Black lesbians to showcase their work and interact with the archival collections. Each festival held workshops and engaged the attendees in their conversations with herstory. All of the zines have gone on to feature in art exhibitions. One in particular is the Graphic Activism exhibition curated by Flavia Rando, Elvis Bakaitis, Colette Montoya, and Ann Packner. And I'm just gonna do lots of pictures all at once, so get ready. Graphic Activism featured posters, newsletters, zines from the largest collection of lesbian materials in the world, beginning from 1970s to the present, covering almost 50 years of lesbian activism, so there was actually some before the 70s. It included Leslie Feinberg's Passing Fancy, Passing Women in Their Own Words, organizations like Rivers of Honey, a New York City-based women of color cabaret founded by my wife, Jasmine Smith-Cruz, and works addressing topics such as gay teen suicide and AIDS activism. The use of archival materials as tools to uncover examples of collective community action by labeling these activist posters and zines as framed art objects sit inside of a contradiction akin to a strange friction, one that reiterates its activist nature. I was fortunate enough to continue the exhibition of graphic activism in autumn 2016 at the Graduate Center in Midtown Manhattan, co-sponsored by CLAGS, which accompanied a panel discussion and reception. So with my last 7 minutes, I'd like to use this remainder of my time to focus on the Third World Women Salsa Soul Sisters, the first known lesbian of color organization in the country, and I'm going to just quote from an article that I wrote for the City Amplified, Oral Histories and Radical Archiving. And I'll try and move slower with the images. At the CUNY Graduate Center, I have the honor of serving as the head of reference, supplying direct service to the varied members of the GC community. At CUNY and other universities across the country, although there are administrative librarians, many librarians are appointed faculty. Departmental faculty and students alike are often unclear of the role faculty librarians perform for the university, in addition to the service functions of their positions. Yet our scholarship informs our service. So as a woman, a person of color, and a lesbian, I know I am no stranger to the expended labor of clarifying my role in any given interaction, even to well-meaning colleagues aiming to add my voice to the conversation. So as an assistant professor and faculty librarian at the Graduate Center with the challenge of engaging scholarship alongside service, I find it efficient to apply my archival training and a method that places my research in the real world, thereby affecting and serving people outside of the academy. I talk about how CUNY supports the work. We're going to skip that. The radical nature of this specific archiving story of archiving the Third World Women Salsa Soul Sisters began in 2010 when I sat on a panel at a town hall meeting held at the New York City Lesbian and Gay Center, now the LGBTQ Services Center, sponsored by the African Ancestral Lesbians United for Societal Change, ALUSH, an organization that was the spin-off of the Salsa Soul Sisters. The town hall meeting was meant to cover ALUSH's history, how she began and why, the history of the LGBTQ communities, women of color and Black lesbian communities, and the current state of Black lesbians. A panelist, Cassandra Grant, who's the one in the floral shirt, She's an elder and announced herself as the arbiter of the Third World Women Salsa Soul Sisters archival collection. So she just came to the panel with a box of stuff and was like, I'm holding all of our stuff. This is only a little bit of it. And I was like, what is happening? So I think it has to be me. And so since then, we've begun talking about the process of her getting that material into LHA. She noted that the Salsa Soul contents predated 1980, which marked the year of the first Black Lesbian Conference, thereby making the collection the first known Black lesbian organization in the country and likely the world. At this meeting, Grant pleaded with the community that someone of this current generation takes the collection and care for its contents. In 1976, for example, Salsa published an invitation and statement to the world. I know you can't read it. I'm going to read it for you. The platform begins, "The necessity for third world gay women to organize in our own interests is paramount. Existing gay organizations have neither welcomed our participation nor championed our concerns. Out of this reality, the Salsa Soul Sisters was organized and continues to grow. We function as a loosely structured collective, recognizing the varied academic class, age, and economic differences that exist in the group. We see this diversity as enriching our experiences and contributing to the emotional and intellectual growth of the organization." That event from 2010 at the archives where we did the at-home spurred a dialogue of connecting myself to the Salsa Soul women who recalled that the Keep It On exhibit that was already at LHA included their contents from its previous board member, LHA coordinator Georgia Brooks. LHA held a consistent presence in Black lesbian lives and culture and became accepted as a space noteworthy for future archiving of their work. So on the closing panel of the second National Black Lesbian Conference, the first one was in 1980, the second one was in 2016, it was called Beyond Bold and Brave. It was held in this room at Barnard College, and Cassandra was sitting here, and then Linda Villaros was sitting there, and Alexis Pauline Gumbs was sitting there, and then I was at the end. And on that panel titled Black Lesbian Organizing and Activism, 1970s to Now, we called to our foremothers and paid homage to women who found the courage to participate and at times initiate these global conversations of inclusion and representation. It was at this conference in front of a public audience that Cassandra announced that the collection would indeed be placed in the Lesbian History Archives. Since this date in 2018, a zine was published, another zine, by Endless Editions. A public exhibit was held at the Elizabeth A. This is where the pictures are of, the EFA Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, which is where we held the first graphic activism exhibit. What else can I say? Ask me questions. I would say that currently, right now, there was a grant received through CUNY to create this exhibit as a traveling exhibition, and also to continue to process the collection. So I'm actually going to pay, Stahimili is sitting in this picture. I'm going to pay her, because I think it's okay to pay a Black lesbian, to process the collection at the Lesbian History Archives. And so we're going to continue to process it. There was an altar at the exhibition, which is pretty nice. And by the end of this year, it should be accessible to, oh, there she goes again. It should be accessible to the public, and then we will figure out how to continue to travel the exhibition. And there goes the First Lady of New York, who was one of the members of Salsa Soul Sisters. She was the editor-in-chief of their Gazette newsletter. Thank you.
I think that because we have such a short amount of time and only 15 minutes left in our session, that we should open it up right away to questions. There was a lot of really wonderful material presented, and I would love to hear people interacting with it from the audience if there are questions.
Hello. Thank you for sharing all of the work that you're doing. This question is for Maria. You had talked about working with undergraduate students, so I was wondering about how you, what the model is for working with them. How do you get them? How do you find them? How do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them really interested in this work? Thank you.
Thanks for asking that question.
our research project, which is housed at the University of Michigan, really benefits from a program there called the University Research Opportunity Program. And that essentially gives young students who qualify for work study the opportunity to do those work study hours with researchers on research projects. So I like to say that I'm constantly saving students of color and working class students from working in the dining halls and serving their more wealthy peers. And instead giving them the opportunity to work on my project. I'd also like to point out, I know I mentioned this, that Annalisa Ruiz, who's here, Barnard student, worked with the project over the summer through was it UROP or SROP or one of those? So they're SROP, so these are extensions of the UROP program that allow students to come from other institutions and work with faculty. In terms of training the students, we really start with secondary background material, which tend to exclude, as I said, Chicanas, but they need to understand something about the women's movement, something about the Chicano movement, and then we just kind of put them in collections and get them to start thinking, thinking about these collections and these stories they're hearing in context. But we also have guidelines for every step of the process, workflows. We really spell it out. So we have like a archivist handbook for our students.
Oh, thank you for being here. On the idea of encounter, I guess both as a social work student and a person who reads a lot of like Afro-pessimistic literature, I feel like there's something to be said for like a discipline in archival work, and that that idea of encounter, meeting the picture, the words, whatever you're seeing for the first time. Of course, it's like exhilarating and wonderful, and like you place yourself in like space and time, but also can sometimes be like utterly devastating. So do you? Say what? Can also be utterly devastating. So in these encounters, that like these things that you're witnessing or reading, bearing witness to, is there anything from your archival practice that you think would be beneficial for other disciplines to understand? So I feel like we put like information over here. I can read this whole book that's about like these incredible but also like horrible things, but it's fine. There's no like emotional life to it. The emotions are like over here. I feel like archiving brings those two things together in the way that they actually exist. So do you think that there are things that like activists, organizations, or like social workers or anyone, other disciplines can learn from like the archival practice of reading these things and bringing those two worlds together?
I think, I can respond to that. I usually I've worked with doctoral students, and there tends to be an oversaturation of information that people have to reconcile as they sift through academic databases, Google Scholar, all of the places where you go to find things. And I say that it's important to slow down and think about the individual people that are behind every text. Mm-hmm. Think about like who's the author that you're reading? What did they look like? What was their voice like? Do you want to be their friend? I mean, literally personifying the object is what one does when processing a collection. Mm-hmm. And so if you can look at an actual physical object and create a story around it, create context for it, it's also important to put the academic work in context as well. So you understand that it was published before this other thing, and so it's in conversation with its peers or conversation with what came before, and at the same time, right, there are the absences of what it's not in conversation with. So often just really placing yourself connected to the author, like in context to the idea of scholarship as a whole. And I think you can learn that from archives, because it's not, the objects themselves are not considered information, they're more so records. Mm-hmm. And they won't really be information until it's sort of moved into another place in the information life cycle. Mm-hmm. So you really can think about, what if this article was just a record and not actually fact?
I think there's another part of this. So for us, and I think, I don't know if you guys are doing oral history. It seems like you also are doing that. There's a lot of really interesting literature on oral history methodology that's actually in the realm of educational psychology and educational theory, essentially, and that really centers on storytelling and transgenerational transmission of knowledge. and sort of thinking about, like, in similar ways, like thinking about the oral history narrative, right, not as an object of analysis, something to be coded and understood later, or even placed in historical context, but as the transmission, the practice of transmission, right? That moment in which I just read this piece, it's really a beautiful piece by Indigenous scholars who do oral history storytelling, what they call yarning methodology, which is an inhabitation of simultaneous temporalities, right, at the same time in the process of yarning or storytelling, which is to say that the students who listen to the stories, right, are inhabiting a past that is being told in the present. And there is a crucial act of transmission there that I think, you know, is something that we need to think more seriously about, right? It's not just about collecting data about the past or evidence about the past to replace a social figure that is gone or missing, right? It's about that act of transmission and the mutual and simultaneous inhabitation of someone's story, where you then become two people walking that road. Something happens there. Right? I think it connects to mothering too, and I just saw so many resonances with what you were talking about. It was a beautiful talk. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about digital technologies. You spoke briefly that you had been using these CD-ROMs, and I'm curious about the possibilities which digital scanning presents, but also maybe some limitations in absorbing what was once tactile. If you could just speak about that a little bit.
Oh, you should take it.
Well, so are you asking about platforms, or I'm not sure. Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that.
Sorry, I would say it could be platforms, that mean technologies, like technologies of light and reproduction.
Well, you know, I've been thinking about the question of technology quite a bit because I'm writing a book about the project that's simultaneous. It's sort of like an autoethnography history, you know. So it's thinking about the ways in which Chicanas in the 1970s created knowledge projects, right? And what has been really interesting to me is there's certain features that are very similar amongst them, right? One is usually knowledge projects are resource-oriented and collectivist, right? They're very collaborative. They're really about not producing a monograph so much as producing a set of resources that can then be farmed out and mobilized, right? And so I see real connections between our use of technology, digital technology, and the sort of rising technology of the period. Lots of people have talked about how the, you know, offset printing completely transformed, like the social movement, the print culture of the social movement era, and in fact enabled it. And so what I see is there's a lot of, it's interesting to think about technology's past, like a kind of thinking about, you know, understanding how technology was being used in a kind of archaeological way. Like, what were the limitations of offset printing, but what was enabled by it? And I think, you know, there is a sort of thread that's working through my book right now as I'm thinking about it, where we do end up with the biobibliographic database. But what we see in all of these technologies is a kind of precarity. That one thing that really kind of brings them all together is both a sort of grabbing the means of production at whatever is your disposal and whatever is free and or funded, right? But then also how that their engagement with technology is always, women of color's engagement with technology is always very precarious, precisely because of their marginal position, both within the developing historiography, but also just within social structures at the time and continuing to the present. So I think the relationship to technology is quite interesting. And there's a word in Spanish called rascuachi, which means put together. It's sort of like make do, right? So making a potted plant, planter out of a coffee can, right? This is a common aesthetic practice in Mexican-American culture. And so I'm sort of thinking about this question of rascuachi technology, like taking things, platforms that aren't intended for your use, platforms that are intended for science, and using them to do this other thing. And then being fine with using it until you can't use it anymore. So then what happens, right? So I think like just living with precarity has been interesting, but it's very similar to, you know, I mean, I think of the Lesbian history archives and how they're extra institutional. I'm constantly thinking about, you know, what you do with actual archives. We do not collect archives.
Right. Yeah, I was going to mention that something to consider with technology, specifically with queer archives in general, is just, and primarily those that are not being developed currently, because most things developed currently now may be digital oral histories, for example, which you enter with a permissions document and you sign off and you know that you're going to put this online. Whereas if you have material from the 70s and before, people were not thinking about reformatting and then thereby disseminating widely. They were thinking about holding something dear close to the community that they loved, right? So when considering how to apply digitization to the materials, it's often item by item and case by case, collection by collection, and also thinking about resources. So most of the collections at LHA that have been digitized, aside from the spoken word collection, which are the thousands of audio tapes that we have, they are done through third-party groups. So specifically Pratt University's library school has, each class would take a collection that we've already vetted, and they'll digitize it and put it up on their server space using Omeka as the open access platform to create the metadata and host it. So in that regard, we have a system that works for those objects that do allow for it. But even with dealing with the Salsa Soul women, when they sort of expect, here's my collection, now when am I gonna get, you know, my like street named after me? You know, like they sort of, here's the collection on Monday, now, you know, where's the exhibit on Tuesday? And I have to remind them that archiving really is about preservation, and it's about holding it for a future generation. It's not about becoming famous or necessarily putting up an online exhibit. Those are very different things, in fact. And even reformatting to a digital form is not the same thing as putting it online. So we can still go forward with the digitization and not put things online, or have different restrictions like the Activist Women's Voices, where those oral histories were curated in 1995, and we had to contact each person and ask them if it's okay if we put it online. And since everyone didn't say yes, it's online just for the CUNY community, and you know, and visitors. So those are, and because of this, these stories are sacred in some ways, and they're hidden for reasons. So even when it wasn't digital, there are collections at LHA where it says, cannot be seen until I die, plus 50 years, or can only be seen by lesbians, or can only be seen, you know, you can actually have these restrictions placed on the collections. So these issues exist regardless of format, but the reformatting of materials tends to bring the issues up even more.
You bring up some really interesting issues, and I will just say that in our practice, you know, when we interview Chicanas and collect their archives, we have a release form that says that we can exhibit some lower resolution objects with their approval first in our curations. But our digital repository is actually login protected precisely for some of the reasons articulated here. Our repository has different levels of access. So you can have viewer access, editor access, et cetera. So the nice thing about it is I'm able to put together a collection, somewhat like a natural science museum might do, like grab a bunch of things, put it together, put it in an isolated collection, right? Things that I know we have permission to share for educational purposes through our platform, and then give an instructor access to that collection in particular. That might be a collection of oral histories that we have permissions for. That might be a collection of objects related to a certain event. And so I think the other thing about digital archiving that has really worked for us, nobody on the project, we have created a lot of archivists. A lot of our students go on to study at schools of information, master's and PhD students. But, you know, and we worked with a digital archivist in the beginning to set up everything. But one of the things that is really beneficial about digital archiving is that it enables the turnaround time between ingesting a collection, like this collection of photographs, 2,000 photographs, right? We were able to ingest that collection, catalog it, and we had high resolution images already organized with metadata, so that when it came time to curate 2 years later an exhibition, a traveling exhibition of her photography, we could have huge images from slides blown up to like this size. That turnaround from 2014 to 2016, to have that large of an archive cataloged and have an exhibition already up is kind of incredible, right? That would not happen at a library. So a lot of these women, those who have donated some materials to libraries, have been very frustrated
because librarians often promise that they can digitize and make them available to the public, and the women themselves are actually quite invested in having those materials available for public knowledge and public scholarship. And they get very frustrated at the long delay of the process. We work with very few people and very little resources, but because we work with students, that work can continue, you know, and that's been really an interesting part of the process.
Thank you. Will you all join me in thanking our two panelists for wonderful presentations?